What if Napoleon had won the Waterloo campaign in 1815? For 200 years, the word Waterloo has meant one thing: total, final, unrecoverable defeat. It's the word we reach for when a career ends in one afternoon, when the empire, the deal, the marriage, whatever it is, collapses all at once and doesn't come back. And the reason the word carries that weight is that the actual battle really was that decisive. One army walked off that field as the master of Europe. The other walked off it as a prisoner waiting to happen. But sit with how close the margin actually was, because it is closer than almost anyone remembers. A few hours of dry ground, a cavalry patrol sent the right direction instead of the wrong one, a marshal reading a map correctly instead of guessing. Move any one of those things, and the 19th century's most famous synonym for catastrophe becomes, instead, one more French victory in a war that still, in the end, was not winnable. That's the version we're building today, not a fantasy where Napoleon conquers the world. A version grounded in what the actual armies, the actual treaties, and the actual math of 1815 could support. When Napoleon wins the battle, and we ask, honestly, what that victory would have been worth. Quick refresher on how close it really was, because the divergence only makes sense once you see the hinge points. Napoleon returns from exile on Elba in March 1815, retakes Paris without firing a shot as Louis XVIII flees to Belgium, and within days, the Congress of Vienna, meeting to finalize the post-war map of Europe, declares him an outlaw and reactivates the wartime coalition. On the 25th of March, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain sign a renewed alliance, each pledging 150,000 men to the field until Napoleon is permanently removed. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story, and we'll come back to it. Napoleon's strategy is the one that had worked for him before: strike fast, strike first, and beat the coalition armies individually before they can combine into one overwhelming mass. On the 15th of June, his Army of the North, some 125,000 men, crosses into Belgium, aiming for the seam between Wellington's Anglo-Allied army around Brussels and Blucher's Prussians to the east. On the 16th, two battles happen at once. At Ligny, Napoleon personally beats Blucher's Prussians, a hard fight that leaves the Prussian army bruised but not broken, retreating north rather than collapsing. At Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney faces Wellington and fumbles it, hesitating for hours before committing his attack, giving Wellington time to concentrate his scattered divisions at the crossroads instead of catching them piecemeal. That single afternoon of hesitation is arguably the first place this story could have gone differently. Then comes the 17th, and this is where it really gets decided. Napoleon delays sending anyone after the retreating Prussians until midday, then hands the job to Marshal Grouchy with roughly 33,000 men and an order that assumes Blucher is falling back east, away from Wellington toward his own supply lines. He isn't. Blucher, badly wounded from being ridden over by his own cavalry at Ligny, is pulled together enough by his chief of staff, Gneisenau, to make the single most consequential decision of the campaign: retreat north toward Wavre, staying close enough to support Wellington rather than protecting his own lines of communication. Grouchy, meanwhile, marches east into empty country, and that afternoon, the sky opens into one of the worst thunderstorms anyone in the campaign records, turning the roads and fields around a village called Waterloo into a swamp. That rain is not a minor detail. Napoleon had planned to attack Wellington's position at first light on the 18th. Instead, he waits because the ground is too soft for his artillery to maneuver, and his massed cavalry would bog down attacking uphill through mud. He doesn't open the battle until around 11:30. Some say closer to 1 in the afternoon. Historians have argued about this delay for 2 centuries because of what it cost him. Every hour Napoleon waits for the ground to firm up is an hour closer to Blucher's Prussians, marching hard from Wavre, arriving to hit his right flank. By late afternoon, Bulaw's Prussian corps starts appearing at Plancenoit, and by evening, with his Imperial Guard's final assault broken on Wellington's ridge and Prussians pouring into his flank and rear, Napoleon's army disintegrates into a rout. That's the real history, and every piece of it turns on a handful of specific, plausible failures. Take heavier, more decisive cavalry action against Blucher's retreating Prussians on the 16th and 17th, so the Prussian army is too mauled and disorganized to reassemble at Wavre in force. Have Grouchy correctly guess Blucher's line of march and either block the Dial crossings outright or peel off fast enough to rejoin Napoleon's flank instead of fighting a pointless side battle at Wavre on the 18th and 19th. Have they seized the Quatre Bras crossroads hours earlier on the 16th, mauling Wellington's scattered divisions before they concentrate, and strip out the rain, so the ground is firm enough for Napoleon to open his attack at dawn instead of losing 5 or 6 irreplaceable hours. Stack those 4 changes together, all of them plausible, none of them requiring anything beyond what 19th century officers were capable of on a good day, and you get a Napoleon who breaks Wellington's line by early afternoon on the 18th of June, hours before any Prussian corps is close enough to matter. So what actually happens in the hours after that? Wellington's army at the start of the campaign numbers around 93,000 men, a genuinely mixed force, British infantry regiments that are veterans of the Peninsular War sitting alongside Dutch-Belgian troops of uncertain loyalty, since many of them had served under Napoleon a year earlier, plus Hanoverians, Brunswickers and Nassauers. Break that line before Prussian support arrives, and you're not looking at an orderly withdrawal the way the real battle allowed the beaten French army in the other direction. You're looking at a multinational coalition army coming apart along its seams, with French cavalry and artillery free to hunt a retreat instead of a defense. Realistically, this does not mean Wellington's army is annihilated. Napoleonic-era armies are extremely hard to fully destroy in the field. They scatter, they reform around depots and reserve units, and Wellington himself, if he survives the collapse, has an obvious line of retreat toward Antwerp, where the Royal Navy can evacuate what's left the same way it evacuated a beaten army off a continent before, and would again more than a century later. Britain itself is never in danger here. That's worth being blunt about, because it's the single most overstated stake in these scenarios. The Royal Navy owns the Channel completely in 1815, the same way it did through the entire Napoleonic Wars, and nothing that happens on a Belgian battlefield changes that. A defeated British army loses prestige, loses irreplaceable veteran regiments, and hands Napoleon control of the Low Countries. It does not put London at risk. The Prussians fare somewhat better, mostly because of what kind of army they are. If Grouchy does his job and either blocks or badly moors Blucher's force around Wavre and the Dial, the Prussian retreat goes east, back toward Liège and the Rhine, away from Brussels rather than into it. That's a serious operational defeat, a second beating inside 3 days after Ligny, and it knocks the Prussian army out of the immediate campaign. But it does not knock Prussia out of the war, and this is where people consistently misjudge what a 19th century defeat actually means for a state's ability to keep fighting. Prussia, since its catastrophic collapse at Jena in 1806, had rebuilt its entire military system around exactly this kind of resilience. A professional corps backed by a mass reserve system called the Landwehr that could put fresh troops in the field within weeks, not months. Blucher's field army might be temporarily broken. The Prussian state's capacity, and more importantly, its will to keep fighting, is arguably the least dented of any single factor in this entire scenario, because Prussian hostility to Napoleon by 1815 runs deeper than any battlefield outcome can touch. Now, the question that actually decides this whole alternate history: can Napoleon exploit the win before the rest of the coalition reacts? And the honest answer is that there's very little window to exploit, because the rest of the coalition was never waiting on Waterloo's outcome to begin with. Remember that alliance treaty from the 25th of March. Austria's army of the Upper Rhine under Field Marshal Schwarzenberg. Something in the range of 230 to 260,000 men was already mobilizing and began crossing the Rhine on the 19th of June, one day after Waterloo happens in our actual timeline, and that crossing was scheduled regardless of what happened in Belgium. A second Austrian-led force under Fremont, 50 to 60,000 Austrian and Piedmontese troops, was moving through the Alpine passes toward Lyon by the same week, and Russia's main field army under Barclay de Tolly, somewhere between 170 and 200,000 men, crossed the Rhine at Mannheim on the 25th of June and was marching hard to join the Austrians. None of that machinery cares whether Wellington won or lost at Waterloo. It was set in motion by a diplomatic decision made in Vienna in March, built on the coalition's shared and, by this point, thoroughly reasonable conviction that Napoleon could not be allowed to remain in power under any circumstances, win or lose, one battle or 10. So the realistic window Napoleon has to exploit a Waterloo victory isn't measured in months. It's measured in perhaps 2 or 3 weeks before an army roughly double the size of anything he can field starts crossing his eastern frontier, with a second one coming through the south. Which brings us to the question everyone asks in these what-ifs. Does Napoleon march on Vienna? And here, the answer has to be a flat no, not because it's dramatically unsatisfying, but because the logistics simply do not support it. Brussels to Vienna is well over 1,000 kilometers, cutting through German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, that were not neutral ground in 1815. They were coalition members or coalition-aligned members of the German Confederation, hostile territory the entire way. And that 1,000-kilometer route runs straight through where Schwarzenberg's Austrian army is already positioned. Napoleon would need to defeat an army larger than his entire army of the north just to clear a path east before covering the actual distance to Vienna, all while leaving Paris and his southern frontier essentially undefended against Fremont's 50 to 60,000 men already moving on Lyon, and whatever royalist uprising is simmering in the Vendée, which was already active in 1815 regardless of what happened at Waterloo. For comparison, when Napoleon actually did march on Vienna in 1809, it took the full weight of the Grande Armée, months of preparation, and the advantage of France's other frontiers being secure. In this scenario, none of those conditions exist. He'd be trying to run the 1809 playbook while simultaneously fighting defensive wars on 2 or 3 other fronts. It isn't that a march on Vienna would be difficult, it's that no version of the French army available in the summer of 1815 could physically attempt it. The raw numbers make the point even starker. Schwarzenberg's army alone outnumbers what remained of Napoleon's army of the north after a Waterloo victory that would still have cost tens of thousands of casualties, because Wellington's army, even collapsing, does not go down without inflicting serious losses on the pursuing French. Add Fremont's army in the south and Barclay's Russians coming up behind the Austrians, and you're looking at something approaching 500,000 coalition soldiers converging on France from 3 directions within about a month of the battle. Napoleon's total available manpower, counting every garrison, every depot battalion, every unit of the reconstituted Imperial Guard, and whatever conscript classes he could call up in a hurry, has been estimated by historians at somewhere around 200,000 to 300,000 men under arms across the whole country, and a meaningful share of that was untrained, unequipped, or tied down watching the Vendée and guarding Paris. This is the actual strategic core of the entire question. Winning Waterloo does not change the underlying arithmetic that had been working against Napoleon since at least 1813, when the coalition's combined manpower first definitively outgrew anything France alone could match. Would Austria have negotiated if Vienna were somehow threatened? It's worth answering honestly, even though we've just established the threat itself was never realistic. Emperor Francis had personal reasons to want a soft landing for his daughter Marie-Louise and his grandson, and Metternich was never a man who let sentiment override calculation, but he wasn't blind to the option either. There had already been serious talk in 1814 of some kind of regency arrangement for Napoleon II as an alternative to a full Bourbon restoration, an idea that reflected real Austrian interest in keeping a Habsburg bloodline connected to the French throne. But by June of 1815, the Congress of Vienna had just finished finalizing the entire post-war map of Europe. Its final act, signed on the 9th of June, days before Waterloo, and that settlement handed Austria substantial territorial gains in Italy and Germany, blowing up that arrangement to cut a separate deal with a resurgent Napoleon over a battle fought in Belgium that never touched Austrian soil or an Austrian army would have made no sense from Vienna's chair. The threat to Austria's own interests simply wasn't there. So the honest answer is that Austria stays in the coalition, keeps its army moving toward the Rhine on schedule, and any hypothetical soft landing for Napoleon would have to be negotiated from a position of eventual French weakness, not French strength, which answers the Marie-Louise and Napoleon II question too, and it's a bit deflating. Napoleon's wife and son had been living at the Austrian court since the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1814, with Marie-Louise assigned an Austrian escort, Count Neipperg, by Metternich himself, and by every account we have, she showed little interest in returning to her husband's side during the 100 days, despite his letters asking her to come back. Recovering them was never a matter Napoleon could resolve through a victory in Belgium. It would have required actually defeating Austria, and dictating terms in Vienna, which we've just established was never within reach in the summer of 1815, and even setting the military question aside entirely, there's a real question of whether Marie-Louise wanted to be recovered at all. So how do Russia, Prussia, and Britain respond to the news of a French victory? Britain absorbs a genuine shock. The loss of an army, and possibly Wellington himself, would have been a serious blow to national morale and to the government of Lord Liverpool. But Britain's actual war-making capacity, the Royal Navy, and the enormous subsidies that had bankrolled every coalition since the 1790s is completely untouched by a land defeat on the continent. Parliament had already committed to the March Treaty before Waterloo happened, and a defeat, if anything, hardens the argument for finishing the job properly rather than negotiating with a man the coalition had just formally declared an outlaw. Prussia, as we've covered, is if anything the most dangerous power to provoke with a second defeat in 3 days. Its whole military culture since 1806 was built around not quitting after a beating. And Russia's response barely changes at all, because Tsar Alexander's enormous army was already marching west under its own momentum, driven by a personal animosity toward Napoleon that predated 1815 by several years, and by treaty obligations signed months earlier. If anything, a French victory at Waterloo removes any temptation in St. Petersburg to slow-walk the campaign, since it confirms exactly the danger the March Treaty was written to prevent. Could real divisions have opened up inside the coalition? This is where the honest answer gets more interesting, because the coalition genuinely had been fracturing just months earlier. In January of 1815, a dispute over how to carve up Poland and Saxony had brought Austria, Britain, and France's own Talleyrand to the brink of war against Russia and Prussia, an argument only diffused by the shock of Napoleon's return, uniting everyone again against a common threat. That fragility is real and it's documented, but it's also not something a single battlefield defeat unravels overnight, because the thing holding the coalition together in June of 1815 wasn't affection between allies, it was a shared, hard-won conclusion that a second Napoleonic war was worse for everyone than finishing the first one properly. A costly, dragged-out campaign into the autumns of 1815, with rising casualties and rising bills, might well have reopened old arguments between London and Vienna over how the war should be paid for, or between Vienna and Berlin over what Prussia would demand from a defeated France this time around. But that's a slow erosion over months of grinding warfare, not an immediate consequence of one lost battle in Belgium. So we arrive at the actual question underneath all of this. Even having won, was Napoleon's empire strategically sustainable? There's a real historical parallel worth reaching for here, and it's not a flattering one for this alternate timeline. In the actual campaign of 1814, fighting defensively on French soil with his back against Paris, Napoleon produced arguably the most brilliant generalship of his career, a string of sharp tactical victories at Champaubert, Montmirail, and Vauchamp against coalition armies that individually outnumbered him. And it did not matter, the coalition simply had more armies than he had tricks, and while he was winning battles in one direction, another Allied column walked into Paris and ended the war behind his back. That's the ceiling on what tactical brilliance alone can achieve against an opponent with 3 or 4 times your manpower and the financial depth to keep replacing losses indefinitely. A Waterloo win in this alternate scenario gives Napoleon the same kind of short-term tactical breathing room, a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, if he fights the defensive campaign of his life using interior lines to strike at Schwarzenberg's and Barclay's columns before they can fully combine. It does not touch the deeper mathematics. France in 1815 had roughly 30 million people and an army that could be scraped up to 200,000 or 300,000 under the most favourable conditions. The coalition arrayed against it, once fully mobilised, had access to well over 500,000 men converging from 3 directions, backed by British financing that had already proven over 2 decades that it could outlast French resources every single time the two sides went the distance. There's also a domestic fragility to the Napoleonic regime of 1815 that a battlefield win doesn't fully repair. Support for his return was real, but shallow outside the army, and a handful of eastern provinces, the Chamber of Representatives in Paris, was full of men, Lafayette among them, who supported ending the war on almost any terms that preserved their own political position. And the Vendée was already back in open royalist revolt before Waterloo even happened in the real timeline. A dramatic victory buys Napoleon political capital and probably steadies the chamber for a while. It doesn't erase 20 years of accumulated exhaustion in a country that had already bled an entire generation of young men into Spain and Russia. If there's a realistic version of Napoleon surviving 1815 at all, it isn't empire preservation. It's a better negotiated ending than the one he actually got. After the real defeat, the French provisional government under Fouché actually tried to secure recognition of Napoleon II as emperor under a regency, precisely the kind of arrangement Austria might have found tolerable given the family connection. And the Allies refused it flat and restored Louis XVIII instead, because they were negotiating from a position of total victory and had no reason to compromise. Fight a longer, harder campaign after a Waterloo win, and you can imagine that calculus shifting just enough, a coalition tired of casualties and cost by autumn 1815 accepting a Napoleon II regency, with Napoleon himself sent into exile as the actual price of peace, rather than accepting the total dismantling of the settlement they'd fought 2 decades for. That's speculation, but it's speculation built on something the historical record actually shows people trying to negotiate. What it is not, under any plausible reading of the manpower, the money, or the map, is a scenario where Napoleon simply keeps his empire because he won one battle in Belgium. Which brings us back to where we started, to that word Waterloo, and what it would mean if it had gone the other way. The honest verdict is that the coalition arrayed against Napoleon by the summer of 1815 was not built around any single battle. It was built around a diplomatic and financial commitment strong enough to absorb a defeat and keep coming anyway, the same way it had absorbed defeats before. Win the battle and you don't erase that machine, you just delay it and make it a little more willing to bargain on the way through. Napoleon's real ending came down to a few hours of mud, a marshal's wrong guess, and a wound that pulled an old Prussian field marshal back onto his horse, when a lesser man would have stayed down. Change those hours, and the story doesn't end in the empire surviving. It ends, most likely, a few months later and a few hundred kilometers further south with a different signature on a different treaty and a word that never quite became shorthand for anything at all.